Hello everybody. A little while ago I promised you a Q&A session, and I just want to say huge thanks to everybody who got involved either on Facebook or on Instagram and sent me some questions for this first Q&A. Really appreciate it. Some of them really great questions, some really thought-provoking ones, and some ones that really want to explore as well. So looking forward to getting stuck into these. So without further ado, we'll absolutely do that. First of all, just want to say thank you to David Kane. David, you've asked some great questions, and I hopefully did them justice by giving you my opinions. Your first question was, I had said that Nina changed a lot from the beginning stages of writing Rogue towards the end. Did Thomas from the B series have a similar evolution, or did he largely stay as I envisioned him? Actually, with Thomas, he very much did stay as I envisioned him. I think with Thomas and Catherine in particular, they had been in my head for so long that I had a very good idea of who they are, what I wanted to do with them, what I wanted them to be like. Thomas had some real influences from sort of characters I was really enchanted by sort of growing up, particularly Dirk Pitt from Clive Cussler's novels. He was, sort of certainly an old school hunter, perhaps a little bit arrogant, a little bit up himself a little bit, but obviously he had been humbled by previous sort of his past and things that had happened to him, to that sort of thing. Catherine very much so the same way. I think probably as the B series has evolved, Thomas has definitely softened a little. He's no longer quite so arrogant. I think being a dad is good for him. Yeah, but otherwise, yeah, he was very much pretty much as I envisioned him. With Nina, it was very different. When I wrote her character profile and I was answering myself questions and things like that, she started off being very quite girly, to be honest. There was, she had a horse, and there was all these sort of cliches. And as I started writing the character, I just wasn't comfortable with them. It's an interesting aspect always being a man writing a female character anyway, and I think that, to try and avoid some of the cliches and as much sexism as you possibly can is always a pretty good idea. But because the story was so rooted in sort of Native American mythology and folklore anyway, and given the hardships and sort of prejudices that they have to put up with and have always had to put up with, there was no way that she was just going to be this sort of meek and mild person, and that became very clear as I started writing her. I think it was Truman Capote who said, never blame a writer for things the characters say or do. And in the case of Nina, it was very much that was what became evident. She was a very different person to what I envisaged. But yes, no, some characters I have a really clear cut idea of who they are. Others definitely evolve over time. For instance, in Predatory Nature, the book I'm writing at the moment, which is the fourth in the Beast series, that I'm writing a character who absolutely started off as a real villain, and has very much become an anti-hero. He's we can probably sympathise with his goals and what he sort of agrees with, or what his principles are. Perhaps just not his methodology. So yeah, it's a really interesting one, and thanks very much for that. Historical one now. Sort of, you asked what my opinions were on the 2000 alleged big cat attack on Josh Hopkins in 2000, which happened in Monmouthshire. It's really difficult without having, I've never had any personal contact with Josh or his mum. I've only seen sort of the reports and the follow-up reports which were done a few years later. I've seen the photographs that everybody else has seen. I'll be honest, I'm very sceptical. the nature of the wounds that he had on his face and on his jaw don't really line up with my understanding of the big cat attack. So, the idea so for those of you who don't know, the Josh Hopkins incident, young boy who said he was attacked by a big cat and was seen with claw marks across his face and a small puncture wound here. In later reports, I did see that he apparently had a puncture wound on his head, but I haven't been able to verify that. But I have heard at least one report that there was a puncture wound in his head, which correlates with what Josh said, which was that he surprised this large black cat, probably a leopard, based on his description, which reared up at him and cuffed him and pulled his head towards its mouth. So yeah. However, when you look at how sort of big cats cuff and use their claws, you tend not to see these scraping wound marks. They're basically used as hooks. The whole idea of the claws is to grip onto their prey. So what you normally get is, instead of scratch marks, which is very typical of a domestic cat, what you actually get are sort of single puncture wounds. And there's normally basically one claw which digs in the most, and that's not so. You normally actually get one, maybe two puncture marks from a big cat. When they put their hooks into you as such, and hooks are the right word really, because that's the sort of the shape of the claw, and that's exactly what they're designed to do. You don't typically see, the sort of cartoon, caricature sort of scratch marks. That's something that you either see from sort of humans, or one person, or at least one report I saw, suggested that he'd been scratched by brambles. As far as I'm aware, Josh has never changed his story. And again, as I say, it's very difficult to past sort of too much aspersion on his story without talking to him, but it's not typical. It was not what I would call typical for a big cat sort of encounter, or an aggressive big cat encounter. It doesn't quite make sense to me. It's very superficial, for a big cat encounter. So I'm not convinced by that one, but very happy, to be proven wrong. I'd love to speak to Josh. I'd love to speak, and find out more. It's a classic, pivotal point in sort of British big cat history. I would absolutely love to speak to Josh and find out more. But my gut instinct is that something, probably did happen, but might not have been a big cat. Right, so which cryptids do I think are most likely to exist? So I think there could be all sorts of things, undiscovered, without a doubt. I think you've probably heard the phrase the sixth mass extinction, which is currently ongoing. And we're probably losing species we've never even discovered, or we're losing species before we've discovered them, which is heartbreaking really. But in terms of the question, I think the evidence for a creature like Bigfoot or the Sasquatch is intriguing. I think there are so many sightings now. I think the footprint evidence, particularly being captured by Dr. Jeff Meldrum, is really, really compelling. So I think the sightings are consistent. People, are learning more about animal behaviour, but a lot of the things that they're describing, make sense in terms of behaviour. In terms of the footprint evidence, with things like, sort of the, dermal ridges and sort of, some of the feet features, they would be very hard to actually sort of, fake. So I think there's a lot of evidence there. I think there's really good evidence that the thylacine, or Tasmanian tiger, is still around, perhaps on the island of Tasmania, but also in some very remote aspects, within inside central Australia itself. I think there's some really interesting video footage out there, and if I can master YouTube, I will try to find some links and post them in the description for you. But there are some really interesting videos out there when it comes to the thylacine. What else do I think is possible? I think there are certainly bound to be things in the oceans that we haven't discovered yet. So, for instance, I'm sure that we could well see sea serpents. I think one of the first things I ever did as a child actually was create a field guide to sea serpents and lake monsters, which I think I still have somewhere. I'll try and take pictures of that and share. So yes, I think there's good evidence for a lot of these sort of creatures. Again, unknown hominids like the Yeti or the abominable snowman. I think there's some evidence for those. One of my favourites is the Loch Ness monster, but unfortunately, I just don't think the evidence is there. I'd love it to be, because it really is one of my favourites, but I just don't think there's any evidence there, or real evidence for there being the Loch Ness monster, unfortunately. But yeah, there's certainly things out there. I think so for instance, in the Daughters of the Darkness, I talked about a creature known as the Mingwa, which was an animal sort of reported in East Africa. It was a sort of meant to have pug marks the size of sort of like an oversized leopard, but had this strange white dusky hide with spots. My thoughts are that it probably did exist. It was tracked and sort of documented by a couple of sort of well-known hunters and sort of military personnel in the area. They spoke about this animal. It was incredibly rare. It wasn't like it popped up all the time. And I genuinely think it could have been a hybrid. It could have been a hybrid between a lion and a leopard, which is very unlikely to happen, but not impossible. We know that from sort of captive breedings. So yeah, I think there's all sorts of possibilities out there. There's potential sort of one-offs as such, mutations without a doubt, but I think there's plenty unknown out there for us to find out about and get to grips with. Another good one. So, thoughts on the Myakka Skunk Ape photos from 2000. So, if you've ever seen them, and again, I'll try and link them or integrate them into the video, but the Myakka Skunk Ape was a picture taken in Florida in 2000 by an elderly couple whose garden was being visited by this creature. And when you see the photos, and there are two photos, of which are widely distributed, so it's worth finding them. When you see them, you see what looks to be a very large, upright sort of ape-like animal. It's an interesting one because my gut instinct is that it's a chimpanzee. It's an orangutan. It's a Borneo or Bornean orangutan, because it's got very dark fur. It stands up. You see its teeth. You see the canines like a male would have. It's got a very dark face. It's got the right colour. Sort of hair. It's not. I think it's a relatively young animal, but it looks to me like an orangutan. Florida is well known for being a gateway for pretty much every exotic animal you can possibly imagine. It's a distribution center. Animals get flown into Florida. There's warehouses which sort of stored them. It's well known that one of the warehouses, particularly a reptile warehouse, was severely damaged in a storm, which has led to many invasive species being now pretty much having a real sort of foothold in Florida. it's not unheard of. I don't think it's unthinkable that something very similar could have happened with an orangutan, which is, as I say, what I think it is. I don't think it's a pest in the sea. I think if you were to wander around Florida in an orangutan suit, you would be taking your life in your hands. Um, I don't. I think it's a real animal, and the reason I think it's a real animal is because in between the first and the second photo, you see the pupils of the animal have dilated, after the flash from the first photo. So it's a really intriguing one, because if it's not orangutan, it's a very orangutan-like creature. And I think what's really interesting about the skunk ape reports are that they're meant to be slightly smaller than typical Sasquatches. They obviously get their name because they're meant to smell relatively bad. They're meant to have this, thick matted hair, which again, we do associate with orangutans, particularly older males. So yeah, it's a really interesting and intriguing photo. I certainly think it's genuine. I think it's a real animal. I just think it's an orangutan, or if it isn't, it's definitely an orangutan-like creature, which would be really interesting. So yeah, thanks for that one. Oh, another good one. This will be a favourite. This is just a tricky one to answer. So in my Bigfoot book Rogue, I reference what's known as the Land Between the Lakes massacre, which is an incident that took place, or allegedly took place, in 1982 in the Land Between the Lakes region in Kentucky. And allegedly what happened was that a family were camping, a designated camp area, relatively remote one, and the entire family, mum, dad, son and daughter, were attacked and killed by what we now know as a dogman, an upright, canine, aggressive creature, which has become into some notoriety now. So, it's becoming much more well known, and with more reports being sort of coming through these days. There's very little documented evidence for it. There is one report from basically there is a report from an older woman who ran a gas station, who gave us the report origin of the two police officers who were one of the firsts at the scene, and were so sort of traumatized by what they experienced and saw. They needed a break, went to this petrol station. One was apparently physically ill, and the other bought cigarettes, got and sort of calmed themselves down, and sort of discussed vaguely what they had seen. So there is that. There are documented aspects of the site. So I know. There are various investigators who believe they found the original site. But there's no documented evidence. That what's really interesting is that there is a span of alleged attacks throughout that area that happened. So I think spanning from the 1970s, there was a lone camper or three campers actually, or hunters, who described having something large come up to their tent and circle it, growling, being very aggressive. It wasn't something they were familiar with. There was also a hunter after the 1982 incident who again was victim to an animal attack and unfortunately died and was killed. And again, really, there shouldn't be anything in that area that should really be capable of this sort of level of savagery, particularly against armed hunters, you'd have thought. We do know that a large section of the park was repurposed and sort of closed down, made difficult to enter. So it's a really interesting one. There isn't a lot of documented evidence. I think something must have happened, for there to be so much rigor. Or I suppose what I want is that I want it to happen. Although that sounds quite morbid and not fair on the victims, but it's such a enduring legend that part of me just thinks there must be something there, and I know there are people who have looked into this much deeper than I have. So yes, I do think that something must have happened at the LBL. I think there is something to it. I'd love to look into it more. I also know, that in recent years somebody came forward and said they were an actual witness to the event. I'm not that person. I have my doubts about, if I'm being honest. There are aspects of his story that don't quite match up. So yeah, it's an interesting one. Again, I just think it's a really interesting aspect and one of the most notorious sort of stories in cryptid folklore at the moment. And even Small Town Monsters have now done some exposure on that. I do know as well that there was a sheriff who visited the area much more recently. I think it was probably in the late 90s, early 2000s, and had a very, very unnerving encounter with a dogman creature. And again, there was an alleged death of another camper who was on his own. At the same time, whilst this sheriff was staying there, who I've forgotten that it is, Martin Greaves, I think. But yes, again, anything I can find, I will put in the links to this. And maybe perhaps we should do a full sort of deep dive into the LBL massacre at another time. Ty Alexander has asked me, do I have plans for the Rogue series beyond Southern Rogue? So yes, I do. So Rogue is the first in the books, out now. Southern Rogue is going to be set sort of in Louisiana and New Orleans sort of area, and is going to sort of look at a more sort of tribal aspect of sort of the Bigfoots. But yeah, so yes, after Southern Rogue, I certainly have plans for a trilogy. So the third book will be called Mountain Rogue. And very early day, obviously I'm only sort of playing with the story in my head at the moment, but the idea is that I would really like to explore the idea of the mountain giants, which I know is certainly controversial at sort of by any means, but it's a really intriguing story, and if I can make it work in a way that's realistic and makes sense, I'd love to explore that. So yes, there is definitely plans for more in the Rogue series. So Southern Rogue hopefully to come in the next year or so, followed by Mountain Rogue. So there you go. Also, just must mention Ty Alexander has written his own books, so very much encourage you to go and check out Ty's books as well. If you liked Rogue, if you like Bigfoot, if you like cryptids, I'm sure Ty's would be right up your street as well. So thanks for that. And again, huge thank you to Cindy Sherwood, who I think has been, sort of one of my longest and ongoing readers, huge support from Cindy. So just want to say thank you to her. Cindy sort of expressed some interest in some of my work in progress stories. So if you go on my blog, you can look at my work in progress Wednesday sort of blogs, which will show you some of the stories I've been working on. There's a few that I'd really like to see sort of come through. There was one I shared called Bump, which has a supernatural element to it, about a sort of a child psychologist who is treating sort of really sort of violent trauma in children, but has a dark past which is linked to an entity that he called Bump in his childhood. So that's one I'd really like to explore. Certainly quite a dark story, but yeah, I'm sort of intrigued by that. I'm nearly 30,000 words into my science fiction story, Dark Tides, which again has quite a strong ecological sort of message. But I'd really like to get that finished and done. Again, the motivation's sort of been a little bit lacking because the B series and Rogue have really, there's the stories where I'm really comfortable and I know I'm writing. Obviously, also, at the moment I don't write full time, and I really wish I did, but I don't. So, by all means, make recommendations, boost the sales, and we'll see what we can do. But if I could give you a book a year, I absolutely would. Um, but yes, so those two in particular, I'd really like to sort of see come to life at some point. There's a couple of things like there's a children's story that I wrote many years ago called about a tooth fairy, which about well, it's actually about a fairy, the sort of the fairy realm. Explores some of the folklore a little bit more. Goes a bit deeper and darker as you might expect from me, but it's still sort of at its sort of core a children's story. I'd really like to do that. Um, there's there's a few stories I'd really like to see get their moment in the spotlight if and when the opportunity comes. Cindy also asked if there was any possibility of sort of other cryptid stories. So for instance, particularly the Wendigo and the Bunyip. So that's really a really interesting question, actually. So when the Wendigo is a creature I'm definitely fascinated by, or an entity I'm fascinated by. Like a lot of my stories, most of my stories are the reason I've written them is because I couldn't find stories like them elsewhere. So when I wrote Shadow Beast, the first big cat book I wrote, it was because there wasn't anything else like it out there that I could find. There was there were a few books on Sabertooths and that sort of stuff, but there was nothing sort of really out there, nothing really based in the UK. It was still a bit of a taboo subject, so that's why I wrote it. Rogue, I'll be honest, was written almost as a knee-jerk reaction because I kept reading Bigfoot stories which just didn't deliver for me, so that I wrote the book that I again wanted to read. So that's sort of where it's gone. With the Wendigo, it's because it has been done and it's been done well. I think probably the most famous example is, although you never really see it, is Pet Sematary by Stephen King. The Wendigo entity in that is a chilling sort of entity that you never really see. And the ritual, and there's other things sort of done the Wendigo really well. Even Supernatural have done it is something I'm intrigued by. I'm not sure how it would sort of come about. It's not something I've explored that heavily, but certainly never say never when it comes to the Wendigo. With the Bunyip, it's really interesting that you asked about that. So one of the stories I've sort of thrashed out and written down is a story called Shiner, as in Shiner, as a sort of eye shine. And the idea is sort of based on a sort of a remote Australian farmer whose wife goes missing, and he begins to suspect this creature that he never really sees, which he calls Shiner because all he ever sees is the eye shine. And that's as far as I've got with the story, but the idea behind it was that the creature would be a bunyip. And because of the sort of the bunyip stories are really interesting, the folklore, that they sort of, the descriptions sort of vary, but one of the sort of descriptions that gave me this idea was sort of based on like a giant, almost otter-like animal. That's sort of what spurred that one. So maybe a case of watch this space. So thanks everybody for your questions. Really enjoyed looking into those and sort of sort of having a think about my answers. I hope that covers them for you. I will, as I say, I'd like to look at some of these subjects in a bit more detail another time. But for now, thanks very much.